You know that feeling when you're just a bit under the weather? You need a checkup, right? Well, it turns out that whole companies can get sick too. Seriously. They can feel sluggish, show all sorts of weird symptoms, and just not perform at their best. So today, we're going to dive into this idea of a corporate checkup and figure out how to diagnose what's really ailing an organization. So, take a second and really think about it. Is there some friction between teams at your job? Are projects always slipping past their deadlines? Is morale kinda meh? These are all symptoms. And just like with our own health, ignoring them doesn't make them magically disappear. So the real question is, how do you figure out what's actually going on under the surface?
And that's exactly where organizational diagnosis comes into play. Just think of it like being a company doctor. It's a structured, methodical way to pop the hood, check out all the moving parts, and find the root causes of any problems. And the whole point, of course, is to get that organization back to peak performance. Okay, so let's walk through this whole examination process together, step by step. First, we've got to identify the symptoms. Then we'll move on to gathering the facts. After that, we'll get into analyzing all that data. And finally, we'll deliver the actual diagnosis. Ready? Let's get started. All right, first step, identifying the symptoms. Just like any good doctor, before a single test is run, the very first thing you have to do is just listen. You have to ask the simple question, so where does it hurt? In the business world, this means getting a really deep understanding of the problem you're actually trying to solve. And you have got to be specific here. Really pinpoint it. Are we trying to fix a communication breakdown that's just happening in one department? Or is this a much bigger company-wide strategy problem? Asking these really sharp questions helps define the scope and makes sure you're hunting for the actual disease, not just, slapping a bandage on the symptoms. Okay, so once we have a pretty clear idea of the symptoms, it's time for the real examination to begin. This is where we stop just hearing about the problems and start actively gathering some cold, hard data and evidence about what's actually happening on the ground. And this whole process is super methodical. You can't just go in and start grabbing information randomly. Look at the order here. First, you decide what facts you need, then you figure out where you can find them, and only then do you choose how you're going to collect them. This structure is what keeps you from getting totally lost in a sea of irrelevant data. It's a real investigation. And these are the tools in our diagnostic kit. Each one gives you a totally unique angle. Interviews, they give you the personal stories, the context. Surveys give you those hard numbers, the quantitative data. Observation, well, that shows you what really happens versus what people say happens. And then documents, they show the official story. The trick is to use a mix of these to build a complete three-dimensional picture of what's going on. All right, we've run the tests, we've gathered all the info, and now it's time for what might be the most critical part of all, analyzing the data. This is exactly like getting the lab results back from the doctor. We have all this information, but what on earth does it all mean? This, right here, is the real magic trick, turning all that chaos into clarity. Raw data is basically just noise until you start seeing the patterns. The whole goal is to connect the dots. So for instance, maybe your survey data shows really low morale on the engineering team. Then, your interviews reveal a ton of frustration about project delays. And then, you look at the internal documents and see a new, super complicated approval process was just put in place. See? Bam. Suddenly, you're not just looking at symptoms anymore. You're seeing the real story of the root cause. And that's what we're aiming for. It's so easy to just focus on the little problems we see every day. But the analysis lets us see the whole picture, not just the tip of the iceberg, but the massive thing lurking right underneath. And once you have that aha moment, you're finally ready to deliver the diagnosis. Which brings us to our final and maybe the most delicate stage, delivering that diagnosis. This is the moment where we present all of our findings back to the company's leadership. It's the moment of truth. How you deliver this diagnosis is absolutely critical. The point is not to hand out a failing grade or to start pointing fingers. No way. Instead, it has to be a roadmap, a clear, constructive path forward that actually empowers the organization to heal and get stronger. So, what makes a diagnosis a good one? Well, it has to be clear, right? Easy to understand. It has to be based on actual evidence, not just feelings. It needs to focus on the real root causes we uncovered. And maybe most importantly of all, it has to be actionable. It has to give the organization clear, concrete steps they can actually take to get better. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway here? It's actually pretty simple. You can't fix a problem you don't truly understand. Organizational diagnosis is that absolutely essential first step toward building a more effective, more efficient, and ultimately a much healthier place to work. It's like proactive healthcare, but for your company. And that kind of leaves us with one final question for you to chew on. Whether it's missed deadlines, low energy, or just constant miscommunication, what's the one symptom in your own team or organization that might be telling you it's time for a checkup? Something to think about.